What's up guys, hope all is well. Just dropping by to talk about a topic today that is relevant because I am off sick, unfortunately. I don't really get sick very often, but happens to all of us. Probably a result of being run down for quite a while. But anyway, the topic of this video is dealing with being sick, because something that I guess we come across with clients quite a bit is that when they're sick, they get quite worried about not training, get quite worried about the additional cravings that you tend to have for food, particularly hyperpalatable, more kind of junk style foods, because while your appetite isn't super high, you do kind of tend to have some of those cravings to comfort you when you are ill, which is why people will typically resort to things like Ben and Jerry's and pizza and stuff when they're sick, because you don't tend to kind of, I guess, want your typical meat and vegetables and things like that. But I think the approach that people often take to being ill is actually the opposite of what you want to do, and what you do want to do is actually quite counterintuitive. So generally, because people aren't training and they're not active and then they're in bed all day, what they will do is reduce their caloric intake, and this is the first thing that I will try and stop clients from doing, because what we have to recognize is that similar to when your body is recovering from training, your metabolic rate is going to be that bit higher. So because your immune system is suppressed and your body is trying to fight back to fight infection or whatever, so it's become suppressed and it has to fight back, so your immune system has to work really hard. Your basal level of inflammation is going to be a bit higher, and all these things are conducive of a higher resting metabolic rate. This is why you measure things like temperature when you're ill. So you'll typically hear of people having an elevated temperature, and when we talk about nutrition and we talk about upregulating metabolism and things like that, you always hear the word thermogenesis, because the production of heat and the body temperature being a little bit higher is typically a sign of the metabolic rate being higher. It's also reflected in the menstrual cycle, when females will typically have higher body temperature later in their cycle, at which point they're burning more calories. So it's the same when you're sick. When your temperature is elevated, even if it's by like 1 degree Celsius, that can increase your metabolic rate by about 10%. So that is quite significant, and the last thing that you want to do is deprive yourself of sufficient energy to fuel the immune response and to fuel your body's recovery. And to take that one step further and to kind of relate it to things that you guys can actually relate to, when we are sick and when we have this higher level of inflammation, we've got this higher level of stress hormones in the body, when our body is in a more catabolic state overall. So in terms of your muscle gains, if your body is maybe breaking down more proteins for fuel because you haven't fed it properly, or your body is breaking down your stored muscle glycogen, that's not exactly what we want if we are trying to maintain our muscle mass and also recover from illness. So the last thing you want is for your body to be in a catabolic state and then for you to make that worse by underfeeding it, especially if you're trying to gain muscle. But even if you're trying to lose fat, it is very unlikely that a day or two of your calories being adequate or increased. So one thing I forgot to mention was that if you are dieting and your calories are quite low, I would actually recommend increasing your calories, not just keeping them the same, but actually increasing them. That's something I just wanted to clarify. Versus decreasing them is going to compromise your fat loss, because if you're just starving yourself in the presence of illness, what you're likely to do is prolong that illness, and hence you're going to be out of the gym for longer and probably not going to support your fat loss goals. So don't look for these quick fixes even when you are ill. Just because you're not active does not mean that your metabolic rate is going to be way down, because that's not the only thing that is contributing to that. But then to take it a step further towards like what you're actually eating, as I said, people tend to get cravings for hyperpalatable foods and they resort to things like ice cream and other comfort foods, but that's kind of the opposite of what we want. So when we are ill, we want to ensure that our body is well fueled from a micronutrition perspective. So there are certain things like zinc and potentially vitamin C and other micronutrients that may support your illness not lasting quite as long, particularly like we're talking about general kind of cold and flu symptoms that people get. Like, I'm not talking about severe illness, but the general things that people will experience, like me at the moment. So ensuring that you have adequate micronutrients in your diet is very important. especially if you have been vomiting, it's important that you do just get back to a whole food diet that has adequate fiber and micronutrients overall, and that it's not just all these kind of highly processed foods that may not be supporting the health of your gut. So obviously if you have been vomiting and you have had an infection of sorts, it is important that you're repopulating your gut with good quality nutrients. So even the inclusion of things like fermented foods can be helpful there, but again, I don't think you need to worry too much about like the real specifics if you're not yet nailing the actual whole food foundation of your diet. So that's kind of it in terms of being sick. I don't think there's a need to get overly specific in terms of specific supplementation and stuff. You know, I know some people will they try to go beyond their scope and they nearly think they're curing illnesses with the use of certain supplements. Like things like zinc might be useful, vitamin C, although it's been kind of maybe exaggerated a bit, it can like reduce the time that you have your cold for. So it can reduce some of those symptoms and help you get back on top as soon as possible. Something like glutamine, echinacea seed drops tend to be anecdotally quite useful for people as well. And you don't need to worry about too much more than that. You know, while those things may be helpful, I don't think we need to actually prescribe specific supplements or anything like that to try to get you back from illness. I think you simply need to focus on actually allowing your body to recover. So things like meditation, things like going for a light walk, things like increasing your sleep, all sorts of restorative exercise. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention was in relation to training. Should you train when you're sick? Absolutely not. Your immune system has already had this insult that it's trying to fight back against, and what you have to realize is that training has a similar effect in terms of acutely suppressing your immune system while you're trying to adapt and fight back to repair your muscle tissue and repair the muscle damage that occurs during training. So it is an insult to your system, just as being ill is, and the last thing you want when you are ill is to add that extra stress onto your body. You want to be reducing as many unnecessary stressors as possible and ensuring that you're in the best position to recover from them, whether that be through sleep, meditation, stretching, very light aerobic exercise, and simply having good nutrition, not stressing yourself out, not eating crappy foods, and not going to the gym and running yourself into the ground, okay? So a couple of days of being sick isn't going to cause you to gain a whole pile of body fat. Eat adequate calories, don't be silly, don't go to the back, don't train yourself into the ground. Peace out.